17th tribe, the Khazar Empire and its heritage.
Two basic facts emerged from our survey: the disappearance of the Khazar nation from its historic habitat, and the simultaneous appearance in adjacent regions to the northwest of the greatest concentration of Jews since the beginning of the diaspora. Since the two are obviously connected, historians agree that immigration from Khazar must have contributed to the growth of Polish Jewry, a conclusion supported by the evidence cited in the previous chapters. But they feel less certain about the extent of this contribution, the size of the Khazar immigration compared with the influx of Western Jews, and their respective share in the genetic makeup of the modern Jewish community. In other words, the fact that Khazars immigrated in substantial numbers into Poland is established beyond a dispute. The question is whether they provided the bulk of the new settlement, or only its hardcore, as it were. To find an answer to this question, we must get some idea of the size of the immigration of the real Jews from the West. Towards the end of the first millennium, the most important settlements of Western European Jews were in France and the Rhineland. Some of these communities had probably been founded in Roman days, for between the destruction of Jerusalem and the decline of the Roman Empire, Jews had settled in many of the greater cities under its rule, and were later on reinforced by immigrants from Italy and North Africa. Thus, we have records from the 9th century onward of Jewish communities in places all over France, from Normandy down to Provence and the Mediterranean. One group even crossed the Channel to England in the wake of the Norman invasion, apparently invited by William the Conqueror, because he needed their capital and enterprise. Their history has been summed up by Barron. They were subsequently converted into a class of royal usherers, whose main function was to provide credits for both political and economic ventures. After accumulating great wealth through the high rate of interest, these moneylenders were forced to disgorge it in one form or another for the benefit of the royal treasury. The prolonged well-being of many Jewish families, the splendor of their residence and attire, and their influence on public affairs blinded even experienced observers to the deep dangers lurking from the growing resentment of debtors of all classes, and the exclusive dependence of Jews on the protection of their royal masters. Rumblings of discontent, accumulating in violent outbreaks in 1189 through 1190, presaged the final tragedy, the expulsion of 1290. The meteoric rise and even more rapid decline of English Jewry in the brief span of 2¼ centuries, 1066 through 1290, brought into sharp relief the fundamental factors shaping the destinies of all Western Jewries in the crucial first half of the second millennium. The English example is instructive because it is exceptionally well documented compared to the early history of the Jewish communities on the continent. The main lesson we derive from it is that the social economic influence of the Jews was quite out of proportion with their small numbers. There were apparently no more than 2,500 Jews in England at any time before their expulsion in 1290. This tiny Jewish community in medieval England played a leading part in the country's economic establishment. much more so than its opposite number in Poland. Yet, in contrast to Poland, it could not rely on a network of Jewish small towns to provide it with a mass basis of humble craftsmen, of lower middle-class artisans and workmen, carters and innkeepers. It had no roots in the people. On this vital issue, Angevin England epitomized developments on the Western continent. The Jews of France and Germany faced the same predicament. Their occupational stratification was lopsided and top-heavy. This led elsewhere to the same tragic sequence of events. The dreary tale always starts with a honeymoon and ends in divorce and bloodshed. In the beginning, the Jews are pampered with special charters, privileges, favors. They are personi gratae, like the court alchemists, because they alone have the secret of how to keep the wheels of the economy turning. In the Dark Ages, wrote Cecil Roth, the commerce of Western Europe was largely in Jewish hands, not excluding the slave trade, and in the Carolingian cartularies, Jew and merchant are used as almost interchangeable terms. But with the growth of a native mercantile class, they became gradually excluded, not only from most productive occupations, but also from the traditional forms of commerce. And virtually the only field left open to them was lending capital on interest. The floating wealth of the country was soaked up by the Jews, who were periodically made to disgorge into the exchange cure. The archetype of Shylock was established long before Shakespeare's time. In the honeymoon days, Charlemagne had sent a historic embassy in 797 to Harun al-Rashid in Baghdad to negotiate a treaty of friendship. The embassy was composed of the Jew Isaac and 2 Christian nobles. The bitter end came when, in 1306, Philip le Bel expelled the Jews from the Kingdom of France. Though later some were allowed to return, they suffered further persecution, and by the end of the century, the French community of Jews was virtually extinct. If we turn to the history of German Jewry, the first fact to note is that, remarkably, we do not possess a comprehensive scholarly history of German Jewry. The Germanica Judatica is merely a good reference work to historic sources shedding light on individual communities up to 1238. It is a dim light, but at least it illuminates the territorial distributions of the Western Jewish communities in Germany during the critical period where Khazar Jewish immigration into Poland was approaching its peak. One of the earliest records of such a community in Germany mentions a certain Kalonymoes, who, in 906, immigrated with his kinfolks from Lucca in Italy to Mayence. About the same time, we hear of Jews in Spires and Worms, and somewhat later in other places, Treves, Metz, Starsborg, Kologin, all of them situated in a narrow strip in Alsace, and along the Rhine Valley. The Jewish traveler Benjamin of Tudela visited the region in the middle of the 12th century and wrote, "In these cities there are many Israelites, wise men and rich. But how many are many? In fact, very few, as will be seen. Earlier on, there lived in Mayence a certain rabbi, Gershom ben Yehuda, about 960 to 1030, whose great learning learned him the title Light of the Diaspora and the position of spiritual head of the French and Rhenish German community. At some date around 1020, Gershom converted a rabbinical council in Worms, which issued various edicts, including one that put a legal stop to polygamy, which had anyway been in obedience for a long time. To those edicts, a codicil was added, which provided that in case of urgency, any regulation could be revoked by an assembly of 100 delegates from the countries Burgundy, Normandy, France, and the towns of Mayence, Spires, and Worms. In other rabbinical documents, too, dating from the same period, only these 3 towns are named, and we can only conclude that the other Jewish communities in the Rhineland were at the beginning of the 11th century still too insignificant to be mentioned. By the end of the same century, the Jewish communities of Germany narrowly escaped complete extermination in the outburst of mob hysteria accompanying the First Crusade in 1096. F. Barker has conveyed the Crusaders' mentality with a dramatic force rarely encountered in the columns of the Encyclopedia Britannica. He might butcher all, till he waded ankle-deep in blood, and then at nightfall kneel, sobbing for very joy at the altar of the sepulchre. For was he not read from the winepress of the Lord? The Jews of the Rhineland were caught in that winepress, which nearly squeezed them to death. Moreover, they themselves became affected by a different type of mass hysteria, a morbid yearning for marriagedom. According to the Hebrew chronicler Solomon Bar Simon, considered as generally reliable, the Jews of Mayence, faced with the alternative between baptism or death at the hands of the mob, gave the example to other communities by deciding one collective suicide. Imitating on a grand scale Abraham's readiness to sacrifice Isaac, fathers slaughtered their children and husbands their wives. These acts of unspeakable horror and heroism are performed in the ritualistic form of slaughter with sacrificial knives sharpened in accordance with Jewish law. At times, the leading sages of the community supervising the mass immolation were the last to part with life at their own hands. In some mass hysteria, sanctified by the glow of religious martyrdom and compensated by the confident expectation of heavenly rewards, nothing seemed to matter but to end life before one fell into the hands of the implacable foes and had to face the inescapable alternative of death at the enemy's hand or conversion to Christianity. Turning from gore to sober statistics, we get a rough idea of the size of the Jewish communities in Germany. The Hebrew sources agree on 800 victims by slaughter or suicide in Worms, and vary between 900 and 1,300 for Mayence. Of course, there must have been many who preferred baptism to death, and the sources do not indicate the number of survivors, nor can we be sure that they do not exaggerate the number of martyrs. At any rate, Barron concludes from his calculations that the total Jewish population of either community had hardly exceeded the figures here given for the dead alone. So the survivors in Worms or in Mayence could only have numbered a few hundred in each case. Yet these two towns, with Spires as a third, were the only ones important enough to be included in Rabbi Gershom's edit earlier on. Thus we are made to realize that the Jewish communities in the German Rhineland were numerically small, even before the First Crusade, and had shrunk to even smaller proportions after having gone through the winepress of the Lord. Yet east of the Rhine, in central and northern Germany, there were as yet no Jewish communities at all, and none for a very long time to come. The traditional conception of Jewish historians that the Crusade of 1096 swept like a broom a mass migration of German Jews into Poland is simply a legend, or rather an ad hoc hypothesis invented because, as they knew little of Khazar history, they could see no other way to account for the emergence, out of nowhere, of this unprecedented concentration of Jews in Eastern Europe. Yet there is not a single mention in the contemporary sources of any migration, large or small, from the Rhineland further east into Germany, not to mention distant Poland. Thus, Simon Dubnov, one of the historians of the older school, the First Crusade, which set the Christian masses in motion towards the Asiatic East, drove at the same time the Jewish masses towards the east of Europe. However, a few lines further down he has to admit about the circumstances of this migration movement which was so important to Jewish history, we possess no close information. Yet we do possess abundant information of what these battered Jewish communities did during the first and subsequent Crusades. Some died by their own hands. Others tried to offer resistance and were lynched, while those who survived owed their good fortune to the fact that they were given shelter for the duration of the emergency in the fortified castle of the bishop or burgrave, who, at least theoretically, was responsible for their legal protection. Frequently, this measure was not enough to prevent a massacre, but the survivors, once the crusading hordes had passed, invariably returned to their ransacked homes and synagogues to make a fresh start. We find this pattern repeatedly in chronicles, in Treves, in Metz, and many other places. By the time of the Second and later Crusades, it had become almost a routine. At the beginning of the agitation for a new crusade, many Jews of Mayence, Worms, Spires, Strasbourg, Wurzburg, and other cities escaped to neighboring castles, leaving their books and precious possessions in the custody of friendly burghers. One of the main sources is the Book of Remembrance by Ephraim Bar Jacob, who himself, at the age of 13, had been among the refugees from Kollegen in the castle of Wolkenberg. Solomon Bar Simon reports that during the Second Crusade, the survivors of the Mayence Jews found protection in spires, then returned to their native city and built a new synagogue. This is the leitmotif motif of the Chronicles. To repeat it once more, there is not a word about Jewish communities immigrating towards Eastern Germany, which, in the words of Mises, was still Juderine, clean of Jews, and was to remain so for several centuries. The 13th century was a period of partial recovery. We hear for the first time of Jews in regions adjacent to the Rhineland, the Palatinate, 1225, Freiburg, 1230, Ulm, 1243, Heidelberg, 1255, etc. But it was to be only a short respite, for the 14th century brought new disasters to Franco-German Jewry. The first catastrophe was the expulsion of all Jews from the royal domains of Philip le Bel. France had been suffering from an economic crisis, to the usual accompaniments of debased currency and social unrest. Philip tried to remedy it by the habitual method of soaking the Jews. He exacted from them payments of 100 levries in 1292, 215,000 levries in 1295, 1299, 1302, and 1305. Then decided on a radical remedy for his ailing finances. On June 21st, 1306, he signed a secret order to arrest all Jews in his kingdom on a given day, confiscate their property, and expel them from the country. The arrests were carried out on July 22nd, and the expulsion a few weeks later. The refugees immigrated into regions of France outside the king's domain: Provence, Burgundy, Aquitaine, and a few other feudal fiefs. But according to Mises, there are no historical records whatsoever to indicate that German Jewry increased its numbers through the suffering of the Jewish community in France in the decisive period of its destruction. And no historian has ever suggested that French Jews trekked across Germany into Poland, either on that occasion or at any other time. Under Philip's successors, there were some partial recalls of Jews in 1315 and 1350, but they could not undo the damage, nor prevent renewed outbursts of mob persecution. By the end of the 14th century, France, like England, was virtually Judean reign. The second catastrophe of that disastrous century was the Black Death, which between 1348 and 1350 killed off a third of Europe's population, and in some regions even 2/3. It came from the East Asia via Turkestan, and the way it was let loose on Europe and what it did there is symbolic of the lunacy of man. A Tartar leader named Janenbeg in 1347 was besieging the town of Kaffa, now Feodosia, in the Crimea, then a Genoese trading port. The plague was rampant in Janenbeg's army, so he catapulted the corpses of infected victims into the town, whose population became infected in its turn. Genoese ships carried the rats and their deadly fleas westward into the Mediterranean ports, from where they spread inland. The bacilli of Pastorella pestis were not supposed to make a distinction between the various dominations, Yet Jews were nevertheless singled out for special treatment. After being accused earlier on of ritual slaughter of Christian children, they were now accused of poisoning the wells to spread the Black Death. The legend traveled faster even than the rats, and the consequence was the burning of Jews in mass all over Europe. Once more, suicide by mutual self-immolation became a common expedient to avoid being burned alive. The decimated population of Western Europe did not reach again its pre-plague level until the 16th century. As for its Jews who had been exposed to the twofold attack of rats and men, only a fraction survived. As Kuchera wrote, the populace avenged on them the cruel blows of destiny and set upon those whom the plague had spared with fire and sword. When the epidemics receded, Germany, according to contemporary historians, left virtually without Jews. We are led to conclude that in Germany itself the Jews could not prosper and were never able to establish large and populous communities. How, then, in these circumstances, should they have been able to lay the foundations in Poland of a mass population so dense that at present, 1909, it outnumbers the Jews of Germany at the rate of 10-1? It is indeed difficult to understand how the idea ever gained ground that the Eastern Jews represent immigrants from the West, and especially from Germany. Yet, next to the First Crusade, the Black Death is most frequently invoked by historians as the Deus ex machina, which created Eastern Jewry. And just as in the case of the Crusades, there is not a shred of evidence for this imaginary exodus. On the contrary, the indications are that the Jews' only hope of survival on this, as on that earlier occasion, was to stick together and seek shelter in some fortified place or less hostile surroundings in the vicinity. There is only one case of an immigration in the Black Death period mentioned by Miesis. Jews from Spires took refuge from persecution in Heidelberg, about 10 miles away. After the virtual extermination of the old Jewish communities in France and Germany in the wake of the Black Death, Western Europe remained Judean reign for a couple of centuries, with only a few enclaves vegetating on, except in Spain. It was an entirely different stock of Jews who founded the modern communities of England, France, and Holland in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Sephardim, Spanish Jews, forced to flee from Spain where they had been residents for more than a millennium. Their history and the history of modern European Jewry lies outside the scope of this book. We may safely conclude that the traditional idea of a mass exodus of Western Jewry from the Rhineland to Poland all across Germany, a hostile Julius Glacis, is historically untenable. It is incompatible with the small size of the Rhinish communities, their reluctance to branch out from the Rhine Valley towards the east, their stereotyped behavior in adversity, and the absence of references to migratory movements in contemporary chronicles. Further evidence for this view is provided by linguistics, to be discussed in Chapter 7. Next episode, Chapter 7, Cross Currents.